Good morning, and thank you for joining us for the Texas Lyceum's 2021 poll results press conference. My name is Caslin Kennedy, and I'm the 2021 president for the Texas Lyceum. The Texas Lyceum is the only nonprofit, nonpartisan, statewide leadership organization focused on identifying the state's next generation of leaders and providing a forum for civil discourse. The Lyceum hosts meetings and conferences, publishes a nationally acclaimed annual poll, and offers fellowship programs, all focused on bringing together diverse opinions and expertise to emphasize constructive private sector, public sector, and individual responses to the issues facing our state. Tomorrow, on Friday, January 29th, we will host our annual public conference. This year, we will be exploring the economic impacts of COVID-19 here in Texas. I invite you to learn more about the conference on our website at texaslyceum.org. One of the key products of the Lyceum is our poll, which we conduct annually to better understand public opinion on the critical policy issues facing Texans. The mission of the Lyceum poll is straightforward: produce a professional, nonpartisan, high-quality scientific survey that provides the public with specific data points on issues of interest and a time series of key demographics, attitudes, and opinions. This year marks the 15th edition of the Texas Lyceum poll. And to complement our public conference topic, this year's survey focused on measuring Texans' opinions on a number of public policy issues and the global pandemic's effect on the state. The trademark of the Lyceum poll is transparency. All top-line and detailed cross-tabular results for each poll are published on the Lyceum website, which will be posted following this event. The Texas Lyceum partners with pollsters Dr. Darren Shaw, a co-founder of the Lyceum poll, a Lyceum alum and a professor at the University of Texas at Austin, and Dr. Joshua Blank, research director for the Texas Politics Project and the Texas Lyceum poll. Before I turn it over to our pollsters to share this year's results, just a reminder, we will take questions after their remarks, so please submit your questions using the Q&A function in Zoom. And with that, I will now turn it over to Darren and Josh to share the results.
Thanks, Caslin, and good morning, everybody. Before we begin going over the results, I briefly want to just talk about how the poll was conducted in the spirit, if not the letter, of transparency. So the 2021 Texas Lyceum poll is a survey of 1,200 adult Texans. It's important here, I want to emphasize that these are Texas adults, not registered voters or likely voters, which are the population of most surveys you're going to come across. And this is particularly important when we're interested in understanding something as profound as the economic consequences of the coronavirus, which affects everybody regardless of whether or not they're registered to vote or they are a likely voter. Of those 1,200 respondents, 1,000 respondents were contacted by live interviewers, with 60% of interviews completed over cellular telephones and 40% of those interviews completed over landline. In addition, 200 other interviews were completed online amongst unregistered adults to make sure that we reach this hard to reach population. The final results of the survey were weighted to be representative of the joint distribution of race, age, and gender according to 2020 Texas population estimates. The overall margin of error for the survey is plus or minus 2.83 percentage points for the full sample, with larger margins of error either where noted or for subgroups. The poll was conducted between January 8th and the 17th of this year. As Caslin said, the public conference for the Texas Lyceum this year is called the Texas Economy, in Reckoning or Recovery amidst COVID-19. And the purpose of this year's Texas Lyceum poll was to complement that conference by trying to understand the attitudes of Texans at the intersection of COVID and the economy, with an emphasis on the economic consequence, and in particular, what kinds of challenges Texas might face going forward as we try to embark on the recovery. So as we get into this, I'm going to hand it over to Darren to talk a little bit about Texans' economic attitudes.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. And thank you, Caslin, for the introduction. I wanted to emphasize, and you guys will have the full results available very shortly. So I'm not going to talk about sort of the full scope of instrumentation that we explored in this particular survey, but I just wanted to draw your attention to a couple of items. And let me just read you a couple of top lines. We ask in every survey now, at least we have since 2009, whether Texans think their economy, the Texas economy, is better off than the rest of the country. And I wanted to highlight two things. I think the data that we have from this survey in 2021 is particularly interesting. We had 24% said that the state's economy was better off than the nation's. 40% said the Texas economy is worse off than the nation. About 33% said the same. And just for a little bit of context, if you go back to 2009 at the height of the last Great Recession, 64% of respondents said that they thought the Texas economy was better off than the national economy. So for me, maybe the standout result from this poll is that, as Josh and I referred to, the bullishness that Texans have with respect to how Texas is handling things. Not quite as evident here in response to the pandemic and then the economic consequences of the pandemic as it was back in 2009 when you had this national recession. So that's one finding. And then I guess to kind of segue back into, Josh is going to talk a little more about the consequences of the pandemic and attitudes about the pandemic. But the connection here I thought was interesting. We asked about whether people's family and economic situation, you and your family's economic situation, are better off than they were worse off than a year ago. We had 15% said they were better off than a year ago, 39% said they're worse off, and 45% said they're about the same. These numbers are actually slightly worse than they were, again, in 2009. Just for comparisons purposes, 37% said they were or their family were worse off in 2009 than they had been the year before. We had 39%. So 37 in 2009 compared to 39% saying they're worse off today. So while the pandemic has these obvious public health consequences, which Josh is going to explore in a moment, it's also the case that the economic consequences and the evaluations of the economy are even I would suggest a tad more negative than they were back in 2009 at the height of the Great Depression. So I think there's a lot of interesting results along those lines, but let me get back to Josh to talk about some of the instrumentation with respect to COVID and the consequences of the pandemic for attitudes in Texas.
Thanks, Darren. And I'm going to go relatively quickly through this, and I'm going to highlight a few top line results, but I really want to save most of the time we have here for Q&A. So as Darren said, these are some of the worst evaluations of the economy that we've seen in over 10 years of Texas Lyceum polling. And so the question is, well, what does that mean? How does that translate into felt experience? Well, 60% of Texans say that they've cut back on their entertainment expenses. 43% say that they've cut back on food expenses. 39% have experienced at least a partial loss in income. A third have canceled or postponed medical care due to the coronavirus. Many have missed bill payments. About a quarter of Texans say that they have either accumulated more debt than usual or stopped saving for retirement. Even though the economic situation is dire, the reality is people are very concerned about COVID as well. 67% of Texas adults say they're extremely or very concerned about the coronavirus. And, despite a lot of discussion about, misperceptions of the seriousness of the virus, most Texans take the virus very seriously. 71% say it's a real threat. Only 21% of Texans say that the coronavirus has been blown out of proportion. Now, this then tells us it's not surprising that despite these dire economic numbers that Darren had highlighted, when asked what's the most important problem facing the country and the state, the plurality of Texans say it's the coronavirus. 29% of Texans say COVID is the most important issue facing the country. 37% of Texans say COVID is the most important issue facing the state. This compares to only 13% who said either the economy or unemployment and jobs. Also notable within the time series is that because of this particular state of affairs and the impact it's had on the economy, again, healthcare, et cetera, what we also see in this poll, a unique result, is that immigration and border security drops off the list of top issues facing Texas, according to Texans, being supplanted largely by COVID, healthcare, the economy, and other issues. So why would this be the case? Well, obviously the coronavirus is a huge global catastrophe and a local catastrophe, but what does that mean? Well, in Texas, what we learned from this poll is that 4 in 5 Texans know someone who's contracted the coronavirus. And nearly 1 in 2 say that they personally know someone who has succumbed to the virus. So this is not abstract for most people. It's extremely personal. Some of the racial disparities we've talked about or learned about over the course of the pandemic come up here. Well, similar shares of Texans know someone who's contracted the virus. Hispanics are much more likely to know someone who has died. 60% of Hispanics say they personally know someone who has died from the coronavirus compared to 40 and 41% of white and black Texans, respectively. Additionally, Texans have identified other ways that the coronavirus has negatively impacted their lives. 54% say that the coronavirus has negatively impacted their relationship with their friends. 52% say it's negatively impacted their finances. 57% say it's negatively impacted the finances of a family member. Now, the broader context of this going forward, we know that the coronavirus had a humongous negative impact, but the topic of the conference is really talking about looking ahead, looking at the state's recovery and figuring out what's next. And what we find here is a certain lack of confidence in businesses and institutions. And what we asked people was, do you have confidence in each of the following entities, basically to operate safely during the pandemic? And this was one of the more shocking results of the poll to my mind. Only 40% of Texans say that they have a lot of confidence in their own healthcare provider to operate safely during the pandemic. The next institution with the most confidence is your own employer, among whom only 27% have a lot of confidence. 25% of Texans have no confidence in their own employers to operate safely during the pandemic. Even beyond that, no more than a quarter of Texans say that they have a lot of confidence in grocery stores, K through 12, public education, big box stores, local merchants, airports, airlines, hotels, restaurants, bars, gyms, public transit, ride sharing to operate safely during the pandemic, which really provides a certain challenge when it comes to getting people back to normal. If we think getting back to normal involves patronizing businesses, working in offices, traveling, etc. In contrast to this, what's surprising is that 50% of Texans, when asked if they would get a COVID vaccine as soon as it becomes available, say that they won't, or that they're unsure if they will. So 45% of Texans said that they will get a COVID vaccine as soon as it becomes available. 26% said that they will not, a quarter, and 24% were unsure. We asked people why they would not get a COVID vaccine or why they're unsure. And the biggest concern has to do with safety, mostly safety concerns about the COVID vaccine in particular, but also concerns over vaccines in general. And so this is, a big problem for the state. Ultimately, if our main policy response to COVID is to focus on vaccinations, the big problem is, even though right now the focus has been mostly on supply, the reality is there's going to be a demand problem going forward if these attitudes don't change. But these attitudes have remained relatively static, both from going last year into this year into the vaccine rollout. We can talk about a number of other aspects of this poll. We're happy in the Q&A to talk more about racial disparities. We're happy to talk more about the experience of families and caregivers, if those are something that people want to talk about. But I think what we really want to do at this point is hand it over to you all for Q&A.
Great. Thank you both for that background. And I do want to note, we have actually posted the results now on the website. So they are available at texaslyceum.org/lyceum-poll. So you can pull up the exact details there. Josh, let me go to something that you just referenced, specifically around racial disparities. I know the data that came in really showed a difference between Hispanics, Blacks, and whites on a variety of topics that were questioned. Can you talk about some of the things that stood out to you in that data?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think, for the most part, what we were seeing is about a 10-point gap is about the minimum usually in terms of negative consequences. So generally, whatever share of the Anglo population in Texas has experienced a negative aspect of COVID, whether that be cutting back on food expenses, missing a bill payment, having trouble meeting rent or mortgage payments, you expect about 10% more non-white Texans to have experienced this. I already referenced knowing someone personally who's died of the coronavirus. It's a shocking difference. It's 50% higher amongst Hispanic respondents than it was amongst white or African-American respondents. In particular, I think a place where Hispanics have been hit particularly hard has to do with caregiving responsibilities. We find in the poll that Hispanic adults in Texas were much more likely, especially Hispanic adults with children under the age of 18 in the household, were much more likely than white or African-American parents to say that this has been a real challenge for them. And they're also more concerned about sending their children back to school than are white parents, which presents another problem in terms of the recovery. If the goal is to get children back into school so people can get back to work, communities of color are very, very nervous about sending their children back to school at this point. And I would also add to this too, equal shares of Texans have had to spend more money had to spend money on educational supplies for their children because of COVID. Specifically, do you imagine like monitors, computers, tablets, things like that? The share of Texans for whom this was a financial burden was higher amongst non-white Texans. So it's sort of some examples of where we see this across the board, really.
Darren, let me ask you, I know you mentioned you were at the very first poll and participated in the very first poll 15 years ago. But one of the things that the poll does year over year is it asks similar questions so that we have this kind of trend line on some kind of more right direction, wrong direction type questions. Can you talk about some of the changes that we've seen over the years and what really stood out in this year?
Yeah, I think Castle, you've actually hit upon the central question here. This is a question that's not ours. It's a question that I believe was first asked in the 1960s by some national pollsters, but we've adopted it as one of the benchmarks for the Lyceum, and that is whether we ask people thinking about the country, do you think things are moving in the right direction, or are we off on the wrong track? It's a basic question. And just for comparative purposes, our initial survey was in 2007 was the first time we asked the question. We had 28% of people said right direction, 62% said we're off on the wrong track. That was as the economy was beginning to kind of crater. In 2008, it was 23% right direction, 70% wrong track, which I think is the all-time kind of negative response there. In the latest survey, we have 29% saying that the country is moving in the right direction. 65% say we're off on the wrong track. Now, there's always a little bit of a negative bias to the track question. So for instance, if you're close to 50-50, that's usually taken by pollsters as suggesting that the handling of things is going pretty well. Because there's a little bit of a tendency for people always to say like, well, we could be doing better, which leads to a higher wrong track number. But 65% wrong track, 29% right direction is not a very positive rating. And in fact, I think just sort of looking over the scope of the Lyceum's polling, I think it's comparatively the second worst era, going back to the collapse of the economy in 08 and 09. Those were numbers that were just slightly worse. So, and Texans tend to be a little more bullish on this question than Americans generally. So there's a little more optimism that you see in the Texas data, but not this time. Not this time. The pandemic plus the economic consequences are pretty dire. I should also mention, just sort of, and Josh alluded to this, talking about how the economy is not rated, despite the economic dislocation, is not rated as one of the top issues facing the state the way it usually is. It's usually very close to the top. We asked a particular question about trade-off. That is, do you think public health concerns should take precedent, or should reopening the economy take precedent? And by about a 7-3 margin, people want to take care of the public health situation before they reopen the economy. So as tough as the economic consequences have been, the public health issue seems to be the dominant issue here.
Let me ask, Josh, we've had a question come in from Rebecca Fogel at KUT. She's asking, as a follow-on to your comments about some of the demographic data, was there any information around populations most affected by job losses? Nationwide, there's been numerous reports suggesting that that's been a burden felt mostly by women, which could be connected to some of the caregiver questions that were asked. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, I can try. I mean, for sure, that is, I have the numbers right in front of me, but we did ask about whether or not you've experienced a job loss during the pandemic, or a stoppage in your work, or a reduction in pay. And so we do find that in general, there tends to be more of a racial than a gender gap in the experience of that. It's an interesting question because there's actually two questions here, right? I mean, to some extent, there's this question about, the economic impact directly as it relates to jobs, but there's also this question about, just sort of uncompensated care, right? And so, what we find generally is, and this is sort of the tricky part about attitudes versus, just going and watching people live their lives, is that everybody feels like their caregiving responsibilities have increased. And this is true among men and women almost without distinction. But where you see the big difference is among parents as opposed to those without children. And that's really the big difference. And so what you end up seeing is, between the racial impact of job loss, which is greater amongst communities of color, and also these negative financial consequences, which also appear to be greater amongst communities of color. And you combine that with the additional childcare responsibilities, and you can really understand the different experiences of the pandemic that different groups are feeling in society. The poll speaks directly to that.
Let me go back to the business trust topic that you all mentioned. Let's dig deeper into that. According to the poll, 27% of Texans said they have, quote, a lot of trust, end quote, in their own employers. This seems like a relatively fair amount of people trusting in our state's businesses, but now that we've been living with this for 10 months, were you surprised by that number? What does that tell you about employers and also Texans' interest or likelihood or comfort level with getting out and about and going shopping and patronizing businesses across the state?
Yeah, I thought this was a pretty shocking result, and I said it's not because I would say I expected high degrees of trust across all these institutions. I mean, look, we're in a moment right now like any other where I don't necessarily expect to see a lot of trust across a lot of institutions, given sort of where we are in the world right now, based on the transfer of power after the election, the ability of the state and the nation to handle the pandemic. Ultimately, I would expect trust to be low. At the same time, having heard for months about the emphasis on businesses staying open and reopening, and also as you said, the reality of the fact that both business owners and patrons have been living with the coronavirus now for 10 months, I would have thought there would have been more positive assessments on this topic. More businesses have been taking steps to make people feel safe, to patronize them because it's part of their livelihood. What this shows us is that the reality, is that there's really a minority of Texans who are really confident in their ability to safely go about their daily lives. And I'd say the other side of this is, I pointed this out, yes, 27% of people say they have a lot of trust in their employer. 25% have no trust at all. We talked a lot about the importance of grocery stores during the pandemic as sort of being, one of the reliable institutions almost that we can trust. And 25% of people said they had a lot of confidence in grocery stores to operate safely. 26% said they had not very much or none at all. And so, to me, this is actually one of the big findings of the poll. Again, I think Darren, already mentioned this, but we asked people what they wanted in terms of the trade-off between combating COVID versus, trying to restart the economy. And the focus has almost certainly been on the economy here in Texas, but you can't make people, believe they're safe if they're not, unless businesses are doing more to make people feel safe. And what this poll is telling us is that, so far the communication and the operations of businesses are not providing very much comfort to Texans.
Caslin, just to say real briefly, what's interesting as well is, we asked a question about once the pandemic is over, so sort of a forward-looking, do you think your life will be very different, somewhat different, or mostly the same? And 23% said mostly the same, so roughly a quarter. But 28% said very different, and 48% said somewhat different. And so the long-lasting implications of this, Josh and I and some of the people who are watching this have had these conversations about, do we think traffic, and transportation has been permanently transformed by the pandemic? Do we think the nature of public education or simple consumer behavior has been fundamentally changed by the pandemic? The poll suggests, and the numbers are fairly consistent across the board, that at least some change and maybe significant changes are permanent. This isn't just a blip on the radar screen where we're going to go back to behaving the way we did. I think we all had a sense of that, but it's interesting to see the numbers in such stark relief here.
I want to talk too about, there was a question in the poll, and the results were perhaps one of the positive pieces that came out, that just looked at Texans' views and their hope that we will get this under control and we will slowly start to make progress and kind of get back to normal. Can you talk about that data point? And then I also would ask, in the context of that data point, talk about what we learned about vaccines, because those aren't, I mean, I think a lot of folks have that hope because they assume that with the rollout of the vaccine and mass vaccinations, we'll get there. And yet the data is suggesting we might not see those mass vaccinations.
Yeah, that's definitely right. So we asked the coronavirus would be contained within the next 6 months. And 72% of Texans told us that they were at least very or somewhat hopeful that this was going to happen. And this was true across the board. There was no political differences in this. There were no demographic differences of note. About 3/4 of Texans are hopeful about the recovery from COVID. Asked about the economy and whether the next 12 months portend good economic activity or bad economic activity, Texans were roughly split. 29% thought that we should see good economic activity over the next 12 months. 29% think we should see bad. The remainder think it'll be mixed. And so, I would say people are hopeful about the coronavirus, mixed in terms of their evaluation of the economy. But you point this out, which is, we talk about containment of the virus. Really, the only solution of note that we're talking about right now is mass vaccinations, in addition to the social distancing that have already been required. And yet, half of Texans, are not necessarily gung-ho to take a vaccine, whether that be, outright denial of it or uncertainty about it. And I think, the most important thing here to highlight is, we wanted to know a little bit more about the reasons behind it, whether or not it was, again, related specifically to attitudes about vaccines, the COVID vaccine, or also, there's the possibility maybe people, there's just a large share of people who don't believe the coronavirus is a real threat. Turns out that's not the case. Amongst those, that 50% who say that they are not going to get a vaccine, 52% say that they're concerned. And this was an open-ended question, so they provided us with their reasoning, and we coded it. 52% that they have concerns about the safety of the COVID vaccine. 28% said they have general concerns about vaccine safety. And what's interesting about that is this goes back to the racial and ethnic differences. 55% of Hispanics said that they were concerned about the COVID vaccine. 50% of whites, 46% of African Americans. Concern about just general vaccines was 26% among white respondents, 29% among Hispanic respondents, and 39% among African American respondents, which is not a surprising result given the fact that the African American community has expressed vaccine skepticism for a long time, having to do with a history that we don't need to go into right now. But ultimately, this really is the challenge, I think, for not only government and public health officials, but businesses too. Ultimately, if businesses are going to be able, what the poll shows, going back to the other result about business, confidence in business to operate safely, is if after 10 months, knowing what we know now, people still don't have a lot of confidence in the ability to patronize a business safely, well, the only solution is a vaccine. And what we're seeing is that half of Texas is not sure if they're going to get a vaccine, and they're concerned about the safety of it. This is something that the government, state government, federal government, local governments, but also business leaders and others, really anyone who's willing, needs to start getting this message out if we want Texas to recover in the way that we're talking about.
All right, great. Well, on that note, I'll make a plug for you, Josh. I know you penned an op-ed this morning in the Dallas Morning News on that exact point that you just finished with. It is 11 o'clock, so we are going to conclude this press event. I want to flag for the media on the call Lindsay Campbell, whose contact information is listed up at the top of the screen with the DeBerry Group, is the point person for any direct interview requests or follow-ups that you may have related to the poll results. And again, they are available on the Lyceum website. I want to thank everyone for joining, and have a great day.